What's up, everybody? I don't really know where to begin for anybody that hasn't looked into ancient India and Hinduism very much. The amount of information and the stories that are out there about their ancient society is just voluminous. I mean, there's just so many stories. It's kind of what you would expect to find out of any culture that's been around for thousands and thousands of years, but most people's has unfortunately been erased. And instead of having a rich, vibrant cultural memory, we have this. We came from monkeys. We eventually turned into hunter gatherer tribes. Then we learned agriculture and started dwelling in cities. And for some reason, we evolved into being hairless monkeys during an ice age when you could really use a good coat on you, you know? So that doesn't make any adaptation sense. Now, I think the old stories might be true that the gods took some type of humanoid being and made us into modern Homo sapien. But one thing's for sure, in my opinion, is that ancient people lived side by side with these gods. I'm still not to a position where I'll try to define what these gods are, but whatever they are, they had an active role in human society. And then they were just gone. I've never heard any good reason for this. It's just they were here and then they weren't. So I don't think that we climbed down from the trees and started making spears and then started making cities like this. I think we went from a much more advanced culture, and this is the downhill slide of humanity. Secular history tells us that the Indus Valley, Harappan cultures was mankind's debut into civilized society. But the Indians themselves say thousands of years before this, there were kingdoms where the gods themselves would sometimes live amongst the mortals. And there's just so many layers to this, there's no way I'll capture it all in one video. Now, to them, there's no difference between history and religion. History is just a telling of what has happened in their religion, basically. So let's just start out with the first story in the Mahabharata, and you'll see it's a different kind of animal here. One day, the king was in the forest walking near the river Ganga when he saw a beautiful woman walk out of the water. The king was mesmerized and instantly fell deep in love with the mysterious woman. The king inquired as to the woman's identity. "Why do you want to know?" asked the woman. "I am the king of Hastapur, and I have fallen madly in love with you and wish to marry you." "I will accept your proposal, dear king, but only if you accept my two conditions," said the mysterious woman. The king was entranced. "Name your conditions, dear lady, and I will gladly accept them." "The first condition is, never ask who I am or where I come from. The second condition is, you may observe my actions, but you shall never interfere." "The day you break any of these two conditions, I will leave you," said the woman. The king was stunned by the request, but his mind was overtaken with desire, and he readily agreed. The king and the woman returned to the palace and were married. After some time, the queen gave birth to a son. The king was overjoyed at the news. He rushed to the chamber to greet the queen. However, he was confused when he saw her carry the baby towards the river. When the queen got to the river, she put the baby into the water and watched it wash away in the current. The king was horrified. He wanted to shout out, but remembered his promise to the queen to only observe but never intervene with any of her actions. He was dumbfounded. The queen returned to the palace, and life went on. Sometime later, the queen gave birth to a second son. The king had forgotten about the tragedy of the first son and was again overjoyed at the birth of his new son. But again, as he went to her chambers, he saw the queen carry the child towards the river, set it down into the water, and let it wash away again. The king was horrified and heartbroken, but again he could say or do nothing due to his promise. This continued for a further 5 times over the years. Each time a son was born, the queen carried the child to the river and let the baby be washed away by the current. Finally, an 8th son was born. Once again, the queen carried the son towards the river, but this time the king could stand it no longer. "Stop," he shouted. "Stop, I won't let you do this again." The queen stopped and looked at the king. "But you promised." The king looked at her in anguish. I don't care. I can't take it anymore. I've watched 7 of my sons die. I will not let you off this child. The queen smiled and said, Very well, dear king. As per our agreement, I must now leave you. However, before I do, I will reveal my secret. I am Ganga, the river goddess. The 8 children born to you are 8 angels of heaven. They once offended a great sage. In retaliation, the sage cursed them to be born as human and suffer the pains and miseries of human life. 7 of the angels repented and begged for mercy. Taking pity on them, the sage reduced his curse so that their lives as humans would be short-lived. The 8th angel, however, stood defiant, and as such, he was cursed to live a long and painful life in this mortal world. This is that 8th angel. I will take him with me to the heavens and train him so that he will develop the skills and temperament to bear the burdens of the life ahead of him. I will return him to you when his training is complete. Ganga then vanished with the child. The king stood for a long while at the river in shock and then returned to the palace deeply saddened. So you can see there's many layers to this story. They're a lot more subtle in some of the other stories, but one takeaway I have from most of these stories is that the gods are literally living on a different plane of existence than the rest of us. I mean, in any sane world, as soon as you hear about the kids being taken down to the river, you're thinking monster. But then as it turns out, it's an act of mercy. What we consider to be a good thing, a long life, to them is an insufferable punishment. Doing these stories just by memory, I'm probably going to make some mistakes here, but I remember hearing one story where a god or some type of heavenly deity had offended somebody more powerful, apparently, and as punishment, the god was given the choice of living 7 lifetimes as a human or 3 lifetimes as a demon. And they chose the 3 lifetimes as a demon to not have to spend so much time away from source. And even demons in their stories aren't necessarily the snarling fangs, horns, evil creatures that we think of. Not to make things too confusing here, but things don't calculate the way we're used to in the Hindu world. Vishnu is the supreme lord who creates, protects, and transforms the universe, while Brahma is the god that created this world, and Indra is the king of heaven. Then Shiva is known as the destroyer of the universe who recreates it, but oftentimes in the stories, he's probably saved mankind more times than anybody else. And now, speaking of being trapped in the mortal universe as being a punishment, so the story goes that Brahma had created the world and he started growing extra heads or extra faces so he could see in all directions at once and take in all of his creation. And he was just so proud of himself. And this is a lot like the demiurge story. And then Shiva comes along and he looks around at all of the pain and suffering and it's like, hey, how could you possibly be proud of this? There's all this misery everywhere. It's not fair to the people having to live through it. So then Shiva cuts off one of Brahma's heads for his arrogance. I would say the most widely known story is the story of Krishna and Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. But let me throw this one in real quick because it adds a new layer to that. There's 2 things that really stand out about the ancient gods to me is 1, they control the weather. Probably can't say that right now, huh? And 2, they are very good with fertility. They can make women pregnant. You'll find both of these extensively laid out in the Old Testament. The story of Elihu talking with Job. He's asking questions of, how do we know how Yahweh controls these thunderstorms and clouds? And he rides in his chariot up in the black clouds and thunders and lightnings. And then the story of Abraham and Sarah, where Sarah's past childbirthing age typically, and Yahweh says that she'll give birth. They always attribute pregnancies as a gift of God. And if you get into the old Sumerian stories and everything, it sounds like at first they had made the initial prototype humans sterile where they couldn't have their own children. And it sounds like people having the ability to have children was an act of pity of the gods anyway. So there's a story in the Mahabharata about Vyasa, probably saying that one wrong, but this god grants pregnancies to these girls. But then there's a catch to it because Vyasa says to one mother, "You will produce an heir that was healthy and powerful, but he'll be blind from birth." And then to another queen says, "Ambika will have a valiant son, but he will be pale white in appearance and suffer from jaundice all his life." Now, they were acting as servants to this god and decided they're not going to go around that god anymore. And so they dress up a handmaiden to look like the queen. And just remember, there's a lot of queens because the man would marry multiple women and they'd all be considered queen. But unlike the two queens, the handmaiden performed her duties without fear and with detachment. And so Vyasa says to her, "You will produce a son who will be wise, artful, diplomatic, and a man of great learning. He will free you of your life as a handmaiden." Well, this young handmaiden was unmarried, and it was a bad thing for her to have a child. So she takes the child down to the river and sets it free down the river, not like the first one, like more of in a basket, like the story of Moses. And then, of course, this child goes on to play an important role later on in the story that I don't think we'll get to. But the son that was born blind was Pandu, and he gave birth to, or he had 5 sons that became the Pandavas, of which Arjuna is one. Arjuna being the main character beside Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. But we're still not there yet. There's one more really strange birth here that you got to hear about. Now, Gandhari, another girl, had heard about all of these children being born, and she wanted children of her own. So when Vyasa came back to town, Gandhari cared for him herself, tending to his every need, and Vyasa was very impressed by her devotion. So he asked her to name her reward. She says, "I desire 100 strong sons." Vyasa replied, "And so you shall have it." Gandhari fell pregnant shortly thereafter, but after 2 years, she still had not given birth. One day, in frustration, she hit her stomach with a stick and immediately went into labor. Her handmaidens were horrified at the result. Gandhari had delivered a solid mass of flesh like an iron ball, not a child. Heartbroken, Gandhari instructed them to get rid of it. Just then, Vyasa appeared and said, "Stop. I will prepare what needs to be done." Vyasa prepared 100 vats and broke up the mass of flesh into each of the jars. As he did this, Gandhari desired a daughter as well. Reading her mind, Vyasa informed her that the last bit of flesh would produce her a daughter. Sometime later, the first son emerged from the vat and wailed as his lungs filled with air. Outside Hastinapur, the wild animals all brayed in response. Violent winds and fierce fires broke out around the kingdom. This son was named Duryodhana. Shortly after him, his 99 other brothers emerged from their vats. And lastly, their sister, who was named Dushala. These children would come to be known as the Kauravas. And a great foreshadowing of things to come. Okay, so I want you to explain that story to me without using the term genetic manipulation. She decides she wants 100 sons, and the god is like, "Well, okay, here you go." So she spends 2 years pregnant and grows all of this genetic material that just comes out in a ball. Everyone is justifiably horrified by this, and Vyasa shows back up and says, "Now I got this," and starts making all of these incubation chambers. So these gods are some type of advanced beings, and I don't really like what that has come to mean on YouTube. Everyone thinks of advanced as having electricity and machinery, when I think of advanced in terms of spiritual power that is a completely unknown use of power. I don't want to go too far off into it, but I don't think electricity is the end all be all of material achievement. They could definitely make some babies, though. So these 100 sons, foreshadowed by the fierce winds and fires, go on to vie for power against the Pandavas for control of the kingdom. And of course they did. I mean, she had her own little army. And something about these old Hindu stories is there's not clear-cut black and white good and evil. We would think of the Kauravas as the bad guys because there's got to be a good guy and a bad guy, right? But just like the queen taking her sons down to the river, the gods don't think of the Kauravas as the bad guys. They're just the opponents. Krishna explains this to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita when Arjuna has second thoughts about going into battle against the Kauravas, which are actually just his cousins. Now, I can't remember the exact number of how many people were supposed to have perished in this conflict, but I think it was like in the billions. The world was very populated at that time, but there was only a handful that survived it, though. Let me explain this about Krishna. Krishna is the 7th or 8th incarnation of Vishnu, and Vishnu is the supreme godhead. Like, all of creation emanates, he's source. Everything is emanating from him, the monad in Gnosticism. An interesting thing about Vishnu incarnating as a human and a bunch of other gods as well is they can become human and not even know or remember that they are gods. So I think the first few incarnations of Vishnu were just certain aspects of him. But when he became Krishna, he knew that he was Vishnu, the creator of all. There's a story when Krishna was a child and playing around, he put something in his mouth and his mom comes and does the whole, what's in your mouth? Mm-hmm. Come on, give it to me. Mm-mm. And finally she gets him to open up his mouth and the whole universe is in there. I mean, come on, how cool is that? But instead of being some haughty creator of the universe, Krishna is actually very joyful and playful in life. So in the main part of the Gita, Krishna is Arjuna's charioteer, but Arjuna doesn't know that it's Krishna, Vishnu, creator of all. It's just his trusted friend Krishna. And before the battle, Arjuna is out looking over the hundreds of thousands of men out here all about to die over who's going to rule the kingdom. And he starts getting very sad about it. He's depressed and he doesn't want to fight. Finally, Krishna reveals himself as the supreme godhead and says, look, you're looking at this all wrong. You're not ending anyone or anything by going into battle here. All that's going to happen here is they're going to go on to another life. And he gives Arjuna divine vision so he can see his true form, and he sees millions of faces and eyes and mouths, and he sees that Krishna is infinity itself. And Krishna explains to Arjuna it is much more important to fulfill your duty than to worry about trivial things like life and death, because there is no death without birth and there's no birth without death. And the way I view things here is that's where part of the spiritual power comes back in. I look at souls and spirits as Newton looks at matter. It can neither be created nor destroyed. You've always been here, you always will be here. To the gods, keeping your word, keeping your promises is one of the most important things, it seems like. If you make a vow to do something or not do it, then you're supposed to stick with that. But Krishna explains to Arjuna that all the pieces are on the chessboard for this battle, and that Arjuna was put here at this point in time to do his duty, and his duty is to go whoop up on the Kauravas. And Krishna, God himself, isn't shy about it. He's known as one of the most fierce warriors out there. And he even has these divine weapons. There's a lot of different divine weapons that I'm not going to go too deep into, but we're talking destroyer of world type things to arrows that make it rain. And it doesn't matter what flavor of classic mythology you look at, the Greeks or the ancient India here, the gods weren't against warfare. in the ancient world, to me, it seems like a natural thing. Boys are going to want to fight. From 14 to 25, we've got those hormones pumping and, ready to F or F. So it actually seemed like a good way of handling that back in the day is just to form them up in an army and send them over to the neighbors. We don't have to deal with them, and they'll probably bring back some gold. Anyway, this is just barely scratching the surface of this topic. And one more thing I forgot to mention earlier about the queen that kept putting her sons in the river, and then the eighth one that didn't repent and was cursed with a long life. What a curse, right? She took him to other worlds to study and learn from the gods. Now, you can make what you will out of that, but when they say other worlds, they literally mean other worlds full of beings. And these beings can teach people things like mantras, which can basically be translated as magical spells that will do certain things. And I know one of them was a mantra to be able to summon any god you wanted. And if you did things right by them, they would often grant you a boon, which is basically a wish. But there is something in that mantra that taps into the spiritual powers of things that can make things manifest here in the 3D world. And I think that is the true technology of the ancient world, not just electricity and jackhammers and cranes to make buildings with. They don't write stories about the great architects of history. They write stories about the valiant warriors and great kings and even not so great kings. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the next one. Static out.